Firstly, I would like to give a big thank you to our Getting Hired employer partner, global biopharma leader, Bristol Myers Squibb. So Bristol Myers Squibb says that driving performance through inclusion is at the foundation of every aspect of their business. To promote a culture of inclusion, they sponsor a number of national diversity career events, and they have people and business resource groups, or PBRGs, which provide a source of diverse perspectives and innovation. One of the groups that they have within their company is called the Differently Abled Workplace Network, or DAWN for short, and this fosters an inclusive work environment where employees with disabilities are valued and respected. They are currently seeking professionals with experience in biologics, procurement, finance, human resources, data analytics and operations, and sales. And you can find, search and apply for all those open jobs on gettinghired.com. So now I will get back to today's presentation, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Jennifer, who has joined us from the Institute of Educational Leadership. So Jennifer joined the Institute of Educational Leadership in 2013 as a Youth Development Specialist for the IEL-led National Collaborative for Workforce and Disability for Youth, which is the NCWD/Youth. She is responsible for coordinating NCWD youth development and leadership efforts. Her primary focus is steering the Youth Action Council on Transition, Youth Act, a national project geared towards getting more youth with disabilities and their allies involved as leaders who partner with adults and organizations to improve opportunities for youth to succeed in life. Jennifer provides support to these teams of youth leaders, adult partners, and sponsoring organizations who work together to improve transition outcomes for youth. So thank you very much for joining us, Jennifer. If you would like to take it away, I will make you the presenter now.
Well, thank you so much, Gabby, for that warm introduction and for having me on today. I definitely am honored to be part of this webinar. And, you know, as Gabby said, we at the Institute for Educational Leadership definitely, you know, believe in youth being leaders and gaining the information that they need to make successful transitions. So I just wanted to give you a few bullets for today. During this session, we will define disclosure. We will explain why disclosure is important for people with disabilities, especially youth. We will list advantages and disadvantages of disclosure, and we will compare and contrast disability disclosure in post-secondary education, in the work setting, and in social settings. So what is disability disclosure? You all may have heard the word disclosure in other settings, but as it relates to a disability, it deals with intentionally, sharing personal information about yourself for a specific purpose, such as getting accommodations that you may need in the workplace, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. It's important when disclosing a disability to talk about how it affects your capacity to learn and perform effectively, as well as the environment, supports, and services that may be needed in order to access, participate, and excel at work, school, and socially. A lot of times we find it that young people who are transitioning to, secondary education, who may, be leaving high school and going to college or to some program that is going to provide training, or who are transitioning to the workplace, are not clear about what they need to disclose and tend to disclose a lot more information than necessary. So we'll talk more about that as the presentation continues, about what things should be disclosed if one chooses, and what things can be avoided. It's really critical for both youth with visible and invisible disabilities, those that are apparent or non-apparent, because, you know, while a young person may have a disability that others may not be aware of, if they don't get the accommodations they need, it's likely that they won't be as successful as they desire, just as it is for someone who has a disability that can clearly be observed. So it's really critical for both, for youth who have both types of disabilities. The one thing that we like to point out at the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability for Youth at the Institute for Educational Leadership is that disability disclosure is a personal decision, and it should always be the person with the disability's choice as to whether or not they disclose their disability. A lot of times, other people who are in their support system may decide that, hey, this young person should disclose, and I'm going to share this information. And it's really important to note that if you're a young person with a disability, or you're someone who is providing support to the person with a disability, it's important to keep in mind that it's that person's decision as to whether or not they disclose. So disability disclosure is really important for people with disabilities, one, so that you get a clear understanding of your rights and responsibilities when you disclose. A lot of times, we don't realize what our entitlements are or what our responsibilities are in getting, accommodations being those support services, et cetera, that are needed so that you can participate fully. A lot of times, we think that those things are just going to come, but they don't. And it's important to know that disability disclosure helps you to make an informed decision, whether that's regarding your education, employment, or your social life. It's important to note that as it relates to disclosure, in order to get the services you need, you have to disclose. And so that's just the way that the system works, especially as you transition to secondary education and employment. In high school, your school is required to, figure out if you need an accommodation. They're also required to provide that accommodation for you. However, when, you are in the secondary setting, you have to report that you need, these services, which requires disclosing your disability to get them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the different sectors for which one may have to disclose a disability. It's also really important to keep in mind that there are advantages as well as disadvantages to making this decision. Some of the advantages are that, yes, you will likely get the services that you need once you disclose. You will, be more likely to be successful in the different settings. And, it may also position you to, be a leader as someone with a disability, and having such skills may position you also to have the career that you want if you're looking to work on issues regarding disability. However, when it comes to disadvantages, you may face a potential employer who, is judgmental before really knowing you. You may also deal with, other peers who, make judgments about you before really knowing you as well. So these are some of the advantages and disadvantages that one must face. But again, it's definitely a personal decision. So we should know that disability disclosure is not just about services. It's also very helpful to the individual with a disability to know their history and to be able to own their culture and connect to their community. I am a person with a disability, and I can tell you that for a very long time, I was completely unaware that the disability community existed. And I was always the different one, the person, in my community who had the disability but didn't know other people who had disabilities. And so after, learning more about the disability community, I really gained a stronger sense of identity that I didn't really have and that my family couldn't really offer me because they had no clue and couldn't relate. So knowing about disclosure and knowing about the benefits of it and how to do it is really helpful for more than just getting those services that one might need. So there are a few keys to disability disclosure. You have to know what to disclose, where to disclose, when to disclose, who to disclose to, and the rights and responsibilities needed of the person who is disclosing. And so that's what we're going to get into in these coming slides here. As it relates to post-secondary education, it's really important to disclose to professors, teacher assistants, possibly counselors and advisors, and especially your Disability Support Services office. A lot of young people have never heard of the Disability Support Services office, but in the post-secondary setting, there should definitely be one at every every campus, at every school, especially if they're supported by federal funds. And the Disability Support Services office helps you to coordinate your services. They will receive whatever information you will need to submit to get those services. So in this setting, you have to provide proof that you have a disability as defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act, because the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, is what is the law that provides your protections in the post-secondary setting. So you do have to provide proof at this point that you have a disability, and you also have to be able to articulate what your accommodations might be. And so it's really important to be able to share this information with the folks listed here, as they will be helping you to actually get those accommodations and to ensure that they take place. So it's important to disclose in the post-secondary setting because, you have to disclose to get your accommodations. As we talked about earlier, you have to actually ask for those accommodations at the post-secondary setting. Also, it helps to require open communication with professors, the Disability Support Services Office, and the student, and this communication is necessary. Your professors will need to know what accommodations you need so that they can make sure you get them in the classroom. Disability Support Services will need to get that proof of your disability so that they can orchestrate your accommodations. And the open communication really helps so that, if for some reason you're not getting the accommodations, you know who to go to. And usually the Disability Support Services office is that go-between between the student and the instructors. So being willing to communicate openly and clearly really helps you as you disclose to get the accommodations you need. It's important to know where to find the Disability Support Service office. Some universities have an office strictly for that, while other universities may have a Disability Support Services office in the counseling center. So it's really important when you decide where you want to go, if college is for you, to find out where the Disability Services office is located. I also want to just point out that when disclosing in the post-secondary setting, if you don't have to provide all the ins and outs of your disability or your, health care condition. That's not necessary. What you do need to be able to talk about are the accommodations that you need. And so it's important to note this because a lot of times youth and young adults get really carried away or bogged down in, sharing all the details of their disability. And honestly, the school doesn't need to know that. They shouldn't require that you tell them that. All they need is proof that you have a disability, and they need to know what those accommodations are. And as long as they are reasonable accommodations as spelled out by the Americans with Disabilities Act, they should be more than willing to provide those accommodations for you. So I'll just read here the rights that we have on the screen in the post-secondary setting. As a young person or student with a disability or healthcare condition, you have the right to be treated fairly and in a non-discriminatory fashion, meaning they can't treat you differently because you have a disability and have requested certain accommodations. You have a right to discuss your academic needs, your supports, and accommodations in a non-judgmental setting. You have the right to have information about your disability be treated confidentially and respectfully. So they don't have the right to, the university doesn't have the right to share your information with others who have no ties or connections to your situation. You have the right to know what happens to personal information you choose to share with counselors, faculty, or staff. And you also have the right to obtain information about disability support services, as well as the physical and programmatic accessibility at the institution of your choosing. I just want to point out here that accessibility is not just related to the physical, landscape of the university or college that you may be attending. It's not just can I get in the door and, is my classroom on the first floor where there are not stairs. You also have the right to accessibility as it relates to the programming. So, do you need someone to assist with taking notes? Is there, a way for the information to be broken down in a different way that you understand better? Do you need to be provided notes to go with your lectures? These are all other types of accommodations as well. So they're not just physical accommodations, but they're also accommodations that may assist you if you need those types of accommodations for your learning process in itself. So as it relates to responsibilities, it's the student's responsibility to investigate and understand the academic and practical requirements of your chosen course of study, including determining that the option you selected matches your skills and abilities. So, for example, it's up to you to know what your course requirements are, how many credits you need, what classes you have to take by when you have to graduate. It's not the responsibility of the Disability Support Services Office to provide this information for you. You have to, have those meetings with your counselor and, know what the requirements are for you to complete your program of study. It's also your responsibility to recognize that disclosing on an application form prior to enrollment does not eliminate your responsibility to contact Disability Support Services for accommodations. It's really important to know that you always have to go through Disability Support Services to get your accommodations and provide whatever information is necessary, such as that proof that you actually have a disability to get the accommodations that you need. It's also really important to note that, while we encourage young people who decide that they are going to disclose in a post-secondary setting to do it as soon as possible, you should know that if you wait to do it later, you can't go back and then say, hey, my grades were really low and I have a disability, So I need, you to change my grades or let me retake this class to get a better grade. It doesn't work that way. You only get the accommodations from the time that say that you need them and allow and let disability support services know. So you can't go back and undo what's been done. That's the bottom line there. So that's something to really consider when making the choice as to whether or not to disclose. It's also your responsibility as a student to find out about options for assessing the institution of your choice and to advise faculty and staff of your disability-related needs. So just going back to the accommodations that you need, you have to come up with those. They're not responsible for figuring out your accommodations for you. It's also your responsibility to understand that the Disability Support Services Office may not be able to address your needs if you did not disclose in a timely manner. I would advise disclosing, as soon as possible. Waiting to the first day of class is too late because you won't get your accommodations in time. So I would advise checking with the Disability Support Services Office and finding out what their time frame is, and what's the minimum amount of time that they need to get your accommodations in place. If your accommodations are going to require them to order, equipment and things of that nature, it would be really wise to even add a little bit more time so that they can process your accommodations request, especially if it's your very first semester. So those are just some things to think about there as it relates to the post-secondary setting. It's also your responsibility to be self-determined and to be practical. So in being self-determined, that means following through with the protocol that it takes to get your accommodations, and also, letting disability support services know when you haven't gotten your accommodations and following up. Being practical kind of goes back to, asking for those accommodations that are reasonable. If you, have a class that is in a building where there are stairs and maybe you're a wheelchair user and there's no elevator in the building, it's not very practical to ask them to install an elevator. However, it is practical to ask them to relocate your class to a building where you can, access the room where the class is being taught on a, lower level, in a classroom in a lower level of the building. So that is what we mean by being practical. All right, so moving into the work setting, who might you have to disclose to as it relates to work? Well, depending on what your objectives are, you may have to disclose to a career counselor who may be assisting you in obtaining employment. You may have to disclose to disability-specific adult services personnel, so those folks who are providing adult employment services for you, one-stop career center personnel, prospective employers or human resources personnel, and workplace mentors. Again, it's definitely the choice of the person with the disability as to whether or not they disclose or to decide if they even need to disclose. But these are some of the people that you may have to disclose to if you choose to do that. All right, so why would you even need to disclose at work? Here are a few reasons here. One, employers and coworkers are not required, and I repeat, are not required to provide accommodations unless you disclose. Very similar to the post-secondary setting, in the work setting, you have to request accommodations, and your employer has the right to require you to prove that you have a disability and, in fact, need those accommodations. Also, to obtain information to assist you in developing a career plan that addresses possible barriers and accommodations. So this may go back to, the mentor that you may have or the career counselor. In order for them to assist you in an effective way, they need to know, what accommodations you may need in order that you will be situated for the job that you may be going for. Also, to identify disability-specific employment services and supports. So, for example, here we have the employee resource group that may be available, and to help you to identify other support networks and groups that may be able to assist you. To discuss employment requirements with recruiters or other professionals. So again, if you're working with people who are helping you to find employment, it's great that they know what you would need in an employment setting, so that they can help you to ensure that that happens. And also just to make sure you're a good match or fit for the job. It may be the case that you may not be able to do the job, and while the ADA provides protections under the law, you still have to be able to meet the minimum requirements of the position. So employers are not required to rewrite the job descriptions for you, but they are required to provide reasonable accommodations for you to do the job. To discuss disability issues with prospective employers to determine whether requirements of the position can be met with or without reasonable accommodations, and we kind of talked about that already. To investigate available workplace support, so again, going back to getting the accommodations that you may need, and also to develop mentoring and peer support structures with employers and employees with and without disabilities. So we find that oftentimes when people are transitioning to a new job, or even just young people are transitioning to working for the first time, it's really nice that they have someone that they can go to and talk things through in the workplace. And so if you're going to have a mentor in the workplace, it may be helpful that he or she is aware that you have a disability and what supports you may need to help you talk through and work through issues that you may have at work. All right, so here we list a few pros and cons of disclosure at the various stages of the hiring process. And I won't go over all of these, just for the sake of time, and also because I understand that you all will be able to access a copy of the presentation. So, I'll let you look over these at your leisure, but I do want to go over just a few of them here with you. So if you choose to disclose before the interview, it provides you the opportunity to request accommodations during the interview. Now, if you don't need accommodations during the interview, it's not necessary for you to disclose because you don't need those accommodations, and you'll be able to perform, at the level that you would need to. But for someone who does definitely need accommodations, such as an interpreter, or, to ensure that the interview is held in a meeting space where their wheelchair would be able to enter, these are things that you may want to mention before the interview to ensure that you get the accommodations that you need during the interview process. One con of disclosing during the interview, before the interview, is that could lead to the possibility of you being judged before even meeting the employer, and that could cause some stigma connected to disability. Again, these are just things that one would have to weigh, and you want to make sure that you get what you need as you are, preparing for your interview. So I just wanted to point that out really quickly and share that with you. And again, these examples are here. It doesn't mean that these things will actually happen, but they're just points to consider as you're making a decision about disclosing your disability. All right, as it relates to rights, you have the right to have your information about your disability treated confidentially and respectfully, just as you do in the secondary setting. You have the right to seek information about hiring practices from any organization. How do they go about selecting potential employees? You have the right to inquire about that to ensure that you're being treated fairly in the process. You have the right to choose to disclose at any time during the employment process. So that may be when you submit your cover letter, that may be before the interview, during the interview, or after you get hired. But again, you want to be certain that you think about what accommodations you need so that you get those at whatever phase you need them during the hiring process, so that you're not in a position where you maybe don't have a good interview because you didn't get your accommodations, or where maybe your cover letter doesn't go over well because you didn't get your accommodations. So those are things to consider to make that informed choice as it relates to deciding whether or not to disclose in the employment setting. You have the right to review appropriate accommodations in an interview so that you may demonstrate your skills and abilities. So you have the right to talk about what those accommodations you need might be at that point. You have the right to be considered for a position based on your skills and your merit, which is why it's important to decide whether or not disclosure is right for you, because you shouldn't be judged based on the fact that you have a disability as to whether or not you can perform the job, but you should be, you have the right to be considered based on the skills that you have and what you actually bring to the table. You have the right to have respectful questioning about your disability for the purpose of reasonable accommodation, and we'll get to some of those things that can be asked, and so we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And you have the right, again, to be self-determined and proactive. So you have the right to follow up and find out, how your interview went, and you have the right, to, inquire, again, about their hiring processes and to figure out how to go about getting the accommodations that you may need. Going back to responsibilities, in the work setting, it is your responsibility to disclose your need for accommodations if you desire any work-related adjustments. So basically, what will help you to perform the job at your best ability? What do you need to level the playing field so that you're performing just as any other coworkers may perform? Do you need, drag and speak technology on your computer at work? Do you need a different type of keyboard? Do you need your employer to ensure that there is an accessible restroom, that is in the building? What accommodations might you need? You also have the responsibility of searching for a job that addresses your skills and abilities. So it's not your employer's responsibility to say, hey, this would be a best job for you, or really your counselors. You still have to search for a job that fits your skills. So if you, have skills serving as an auto mechanic, that's just one thing that fell out of my brain there. And that's where you work best and you have skills and talents around that. It may not make sense for you to apply to be, an administrator at a Fortune 500 company if you don't have those skills. So it's up to you to find a job that suits you best and suits your skills and abilities best. It's your responsibility to inform your manager, supervisor, your interview panel, what have you, about your need for appropriate interview accommodations in a timely manner. So you don't want to come into the interview and say, hey, I need accommodations for this interview. You want to make sure that if you choose to disclose your disability, that you ask for those accommodations beforehand so that they can be prepared for you. It's your responsibility to identify appropriate and reasonable accommodations for an interview, such as a sign language interpreter or a wheelchair-accessible location if that's needed. So in other words, it's up to you to be able to talk about what those reasonable accommodations are that you may need, and then it's up to that potential employer to secure those accommodations for you. So you have to be able to identify what those accommodations are. That's not their responsibility. It's also your responsibility to negotiate reasonable accommodations with your employer at the point of the job offer and beyond. They may tell you, hey, we can't afford this accommodation that you asked for, so it's up to you to know how to ask for something else that may work and to be able to come to an agreement with your employer. And it's also your responsibility to bring your skills and merits to the table. As we talked about earlier, you have to be able to meet the minimum requirements of the job. So as it relates to disability inquiries, there are things that your potential employer can ask you prior to being employed, and there are things that they cannot ask you depending on the situation. And so I have this slide here that just kind of notes that the question of whether or not it's legal to ask certain disability-related questions depends on whether or not the agency is providing general services, providing employment-related training, or acting as an employment agency. So in other words, you know, a one-stop center may be able to ask you some things that a potential employer may not be able to ask. So it's important to know how they identify to be able to determine whether or not they can legally ask you the questions they're asking. Some of the most important differences are what disability-related questions the agency can ask a customer and what the agency does with the information they obtain in response to these questions. For more information about disability inquiries, we have a link to a brief here that goes into more detail about that. And so the link is here on the slide for you to review at your leisure. I do want to point out, though, as it relates to disability inquiries, that in the pre-offer stage, a potential employer may ask the job seeker whether or not, you know, you can satisfy the physical requirements of a job. You can be asked to describe or demonstrate how you would perform the task only if all the other applicants are asked to do the same thing. So, you know, again, this is not something that can be asked only of people with disabilities. But you should also know, if you are the job seeker with a disability, if your employer asks other people to demonstrate how they would perform a job task, they can, in fact, ask you as well. And they can ask you if accommodations are needed for the application process. And they can also ask you for reasonable documentation of a disability before they, in fact, provide you those accommodations. So like we talked about earlier, it's up to you to provide that documentation or proof, you know, of a disability. All right, so in the post-offer phase, meaning after you've been offered a position, and the pre-hire phase, meaning right before you are hired, a potential employer can ask you certain disability-related questions and require medical exams, even if it's not related to the job, if and only if all entering employees, so anyone else that may be in the same position that you are in, meaning they have been offered a job but haven't quite been hired yet, if they and are in the same job category, have to, you know, answer these same questions and submit to these exams regardless of their disability. And if all this information being obtained is kept confidential. So again, you are protected and your information should always be kept confidential. Now, if you choose to disclose your information, that's entirely up to you. So what do you disclose? You want to disclose general information about your disability, basically just, you know, how it affects your ability to do your job well. So if you've chosen to disclose, those are the kind of things you want to talk about, how your disability impacts your performance and, you know, how it relates to your need for the accommodations. So you'll want to be able to talk about the types of job accommodations that have worked well for you, and why they may be beneficial in your current position, as well as the types of accommodations you think you may need in the workplace. You want to talk about how your disability and your life experiences can positively affect your work performance. I think a lot of times young people and people who are transitioning to a new job or working for the first time get carried away in talking about, like, well, maybe all the details of their disability or health condition, and not focusing on, their skills. And so it's really important that you remember that, you're presenting yourself to your employer, and you want to be able to talk about what you can do for your company and the positive aspects of your disability in the workplace. So they don't need to necessarily know, how often, you may have to take your medications, unless that means you have to step away from work to do that or perform, any kind of medical procedures that, may have to occur through the day. So they don't need to know what prescriptions you're on. They don't need to know, maybe everything that you have to do around toileting and, things of that nature. They don't need those details. They need to know about you as a positive person and, how you'll perform in the workplace. And they also, you want to focus, while you may be a person who is proud of your disability, you definitely want to focus on your skills. And it's perfectly fine to talk about your disability and how it relates to that. So most people find it easier to talk about the impact of having a disability rather than a formal or clinical definition. So I'll read one of these examples here, but there are a few that you can go back and look over. So when arranging for a job interview, a young man who uses a wheelchair might say, "I'm really looking forward to this interview, and I am checking to make sure that the interview room can accommodate my wheelchair." So that's one way to check for accommodations and to talk about the impact of your disability, as opposed to saying, "Hey, my wheelchair is a problem, and, this is what's wrong," and so on and so forth. Having a disability definitely doesn't have to be a negative thing. And I think that it's really important that the person who has the disability present him or herself in a positive way. While the fact of the matter is that some days may be more challenging than others, you definitely want to be able to show your employer, that, hey, I have skills and merit that I bring to this position. All right, so it's really important to know your rights. I'm not going to go through all of these here, but to find out more about legislation that protects you as a person with a disability in the workplace and in the post-secondary setting, here are a few pieces of legislation that you should know about, and you can visit ada.gov and the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's websites to gain more information, and they're in the slides here for you. Cyber disclosure is also a very important piece of disclosing in the workplace, because often folks disclose their disability unintentionally. And so if you are someone who's decided that you do not want to disclose your disability, it's really important to find out what your cyber or online presence looks like. So one thing that we recommend is that you Google your name, type it in, and do a search, and find out what comes up. And the reason we suggest this is because so many employers now, resort to going online to find out information about potential employees. And so you want to know what's posted about you. So just as with, disclosing in person, there are also advantages and disadvantages to cyber disclosure. When you disclose online, you may be able to project yourself as someone who is proud, of having a disability, and maybe if you are interested in working on issues around disability, you're able to showcase different projects that you may have worked on as it relates to disability. Again, another disadvantage is that, you are, lending yourself to being prejudged by others, such as potential employers, and maybe if they, see that you've done work on disability-related campaigns or projects, it allows them to judge you before they get to meet you. So that's something that you'll want to consider as it relates to cyber disclosure. Also, you should know that your disability can be disclosed by others unintentionally or intentionally. So if you have a physical disability and someone posts a photo of you, that could disclose your disability accidentally. Also, if you have a non-apparent disability and maybe you wrote a blog about, autism or, healthcare conditions or what have you, and someone tags you in that post to your article, or you've been connected to an organization that supports certain disabilities, then that may disclose that you may also have a disability as well, or lead others to think that you do. So these are things to think about as well. And then, as we talked about before, you can accidentally disclose on your own by doing some of those very same things. You may have, posted some information on social media or photos, or taken part in disability-related events. So again, it's really important to check on your digital presence, and if you are not comfortable disclosing your disability, you want to see if you can get maybe pictures that have been posted by a disability-related organization taken down from their website, or maybe you want to unlink yourself or untag yourself from posts that may have been shared by others. In the social setting, disability disclosure is equally as important, and you may have to disclose to friends, relatives, owners, or staff members of various businesses, public transportation staff, parks and recreation staff, events coordinators, or mentors and role models. We know that your involvement in the social setting is just as important as working, and it's just as important as pursuing post-secondary education. So if you want to be included in your community and in what's going on, you may be in a position where you may need to disclose in order to get accommodation. Why disclose in a social setting? One, maybe to start relationships and friendships with honesty. So if you are building relationships with others, it may be important to know that they are clear on what accommodations you may need, and it's up to you if you disclose that, as well as if you talk more with them about your disability and how it affects you. Again, it's your choice, but if you want to start things off with honesty, it's something to consider. Also, to discuss your needs to participate in the community and at different events. So if you need certain accommodations, it may be worth considering disclosing your disability. And also to receive assistance while you're participating in these events. So even if it's not that you need formal, accommodations that, may require a lot more detail, maybe you just need, some assistance, such as maybe you're uncomfortable being in large groups and you need someone to help you navigate that space. That may be assistance that may not require requesting accommodations through those who may have put on the event, but maybe you want to share that you need this type of assistance with your friends so that they're aware of it and can help you in that setting. So these are just things to consider as you're thinking about disclosing in a social setting. In a social setting, much like the other settings, such as employment and post-secondary, you have the right to be treated fairly and in a non-discriminatory fashion. You have the right to have info about your disability treated confidentially and respectfully. You have the right to work collaboratively with others to identify necessary supports for your success. You have the right to access disability support services in these social settings, as well as physical and programmatic access in community settings. And you have the right to be self-determined and proactive. And while it may be a big jump to, disclose to people in your community, if it's what it takes to get what you need, it's worth considering. You also have the right to address issues that you may have when people are not being supportive and providing those accommodations that you've requested. And so, again, in these settings, it's definitely your choice as to whether or not you disclose. And it's important to note that people may not always follow through, but in order to even open the door, it's up to you to say, hey, I have a disability and I need X, Y, and Z. It's your responsibility in the social setting, though, to fully understand your disability and your disability-related needs as they pertain to your community living. So you need to be able to tell people what you need in the different settings. It's also up to you to find out about options for accessing the community settings of your choice, whether those be transportation options, whether those might be, different programs that exist in the social setting. It's up to you to find out what those are. It's also your responsibility to advise community members and friends of your accommodations and your support needs. So again, they're not even able to provide you with accommodations if they don't know that you need them. And it's also your responsibility to understand that community members and friends may not be able to address your needs if they're not presented in a timely manner. So again, you have to make sure you make those requests beforehand. So if you're going to an event, you want to, make those requests ahead of time to ensure that you will hopefully get those accommodations you need. Here is a listing of some resources that are offered through the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability for Youth. We have our 411 on disability disclosure for youth with disabilities. Also, we have the By Youth for Youth Employment Brief that was developed by Youth and our Youth Action Council on Transition and adult partners. So it's really interesting, and it's from the youth's perspective. We also have our cyber disclosure for youth with disabilities that gives you a little bit more information about disclosing online. And here is also the link to the disability inquiries document that I was telling you about earlier. And there are also some other links here. I also want to point out JAN, which is the Job Accommodation Network. It's the third resource that's listed on this slide. If you are trying to figure out what accommodations you might need in the workplace, or if you're an employer or someone assisting someone with figuring out their accommodations, this is a good place to go to get an idea of what types of accommodations might be helpful for certain disabilities. My contact information is listed for you here. And again, I understand that you all will have access to these slides, so I just wanted to make sure that you knew that it was included. Thank you so much for your time and for listening as we share this information with you as it relates to disability disclosure. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Jennifer. That was all really interesting. We've got a lot of people really engaged here, actually. I realize we've run over the time, so I apologize. I typed in the chat box there if anyone wasn't able to stay on or if anyone needs to get off now. Don't worry about it. You will get the recorded version, so you can catch up on anything you've missed. Feel free to type in now if you have any questions. We have a couple that I'll start with. So we have one question: is narcolepsy considered a disability under the ADA? Would you know that, Jennifer?
So I believe that it is actually, and you have, what I would advise is looking at the description for a disability is actually included in the legislation, and if you go to ada.gov, it should give you that actual description there. And if I'm not mistaken, narcolepsy does fit within the description that is provided, and I wish I had provided that actual description in the slides here. I apologize for not doing that, but if you review that description, you should be able to determine whether or not narcolepsy is included, but I do believe that it is.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, from my understanding, the ADA doesn't have like a set, comprehensive, black or white type list of disabilities.
Exactly.
I think, they purposely sort of have a general definition so that, depending on, I think, the degree, it would be a big factor. So yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, we'll include, as Jennifer said, we'll include the ada.gov link as well, so you can always look up more details about that. We have another question. Should I disclose my hearing disability on my resume or LinkedIn profile? If so, what should I say and how much detail should I go into?
This is Jennifer. Again, disclosing is your choice. So I'm not comfortable telling you that you should definitely do it or you should definitely not. It's really dependent upon what you feel people need to know. You could, if you decided, you could leave it off of your profiles and your resume, and you can make sure that if you need accommodations, that prior to going in for an interview, that you let that potential employer know that those accommodations are needed. You could decide to leave it there on your profiles and in your resume because you're proud of who you are and you're good with the fact that you have a disability and you want to be completely open and don't mind taking the risk of being, judged prematurely. So that's not something that, we can tell you whether or not you should do. It's definitely your choice. Our role is to make sure that you have the information so that you can make an informed decision.
Great. We've got a few more questions. Hopefully I can squeeze them all in. If not, we'll definitely address them in the email and follow-up information we send. But there's one as well from somebody asking, if you do not disclose your disability up front and then have performance issues related to the disability, can you get the accommodation after the fact, or can you be fired?
So if you disclose later and you have not been fired, you have the right to then request, an accommodation later in the process. What you do not have the right to do, though, is to try to go back and undo, those periods where you may not have been successful. So if a performance evaluation had been done, you can't go back and undo that evaluation if you did not perform well, which is why we really encourage people to think about the time frame at which they disclose if they choose to do that, because you can't undo what's been done, but you can, yes, at any point in the hiring process, if you're still hired, you can request accommodations. Now, if you've in fact been fired before having the opportunity to before deciding to disclose your disability and request accommodations, you can't go back and undo the fact that you were fired. So I would suggest that if you maybe haven't been performing as well and you still have your job, it might be wise to make the decision as to whether or not to disclose while you still have that job and can maybe, get those accommodations and be able to then keep your job, hopefully.
Right. So yeah, just another factor you said before in considering whether it's worth disclosing to an employer. Just making sure you've got all the support that you need initially. Yeah. There's another one. I've been out of the workforce for 7.5 years because of a disability. do you have any suggestions to how I best answer the interview question, why is your employment gap so large, without disclosing my disability? That's a tricky one.
Yes, that is a very tricky one. And I think, there are things to weigh, in that process. You may choose to tell your employer that, I was pursuing, other options at that time, or, what have you. That one is really, really tricky, because it's definitely going to come up if they see that gap. It may also be an opportunity for you to be honest with your employer if that's something you feel led to do, to segue into, requesting those reasonable accommodations. So there are different ways to think about it, but specifically as far as, how to go into this interview without disclosing, you have to get really creative there, because it will come up. I mean, it definitely will, and I think, letting your employer know that maybe you were, looking into other options at that time and you didn't, have a need to work, but maybe you were pursuing, some other interests, or if you're maybe if you went back to school or were pursuing some other form of training, it might be wise to note those things if they fit at that particular point in time at which you had the gap in employment. Those might be some things worth mentioning if they, in fact, did happen. But those are the suggestions that I can think of off the top of my head right now.
Yeah.
But you definitely want to be prepared with an answer.
Yeah, I agree. If for example, somebody in that situation said, I was out of employment for medical reasons, would you think, I think they'd be worried about how much detail do they go into, and will that, is it likely that it would be held against them, and the employer would think, well, they could be out again for another significant amount of time. Maybe if they did say something like that, they could try and reaffirm that, they've recovered and, they're committed to getting back into the job force.
Right. These are all options to weigh. I can't tell you which way it's going to go, and that's the unfortunate piece, because we can't really say. But what I can tell you is that your employer, if you decided to disclose that I was out for this period of time for medical reasons, but hey, I'm well now and I'm ready to return to the workforce, your potential employer who's interviewing you at that point does not have the right to inquire about all of the, happenings that occurred while you were on your leave of absence. Like, they don't have the right to, ask you for full detail about what happened during that time. So you still have the right to privacy and confidentiality there. But as Gabby mentioned, it is an opportunity to confirm that, hey, I am in a good place now, and I am able to return to the workplace. I think that, when you're thinking about employment in general, your employer wants to know that you're able to come in and to do the job, to meet those minimum requirements of the position. And I think that if you can show that, then, and maximize on what your strengths are, then it will still, I believe, attract you to your employer, because they are able to really see your strengths and what skills and talents you have. So while the conversation may get swayed into, the employer wanting to know why, you were out for so long, take over that conversation and show him or her where your skills are and what you still can bring to the table. And I think, that will position you for a strong interview.
Right, yeah. Complicated issue. I'll just squeeze in one more before we go. Should job developers who work with vocational rehabilitation counselors talk about a consumer's involvement in the program before there is a job offer or temp work experience? I think that means if you've been working with vocational rehabilitation, possibly like could it be seen as, you know, unintentionally disclosing to an employer before they offer a job?
Okay. So I think that goes back to knowing your rights and responsibilities. So if you're working with VR or vocational rehabilitation and you're a young person, you're asking them to help you find employment, it's important to know that the people that they are partnering with are well aware, most of the time at least as far as I know, that they are associated with vocational rehabilitation. So it's very well possible that they're disclosing the fact that you have a disability as you are a client of theirs seeking their assistance in getting employment. So it's important to note what you're disclosing just by your association with a particular program. And so I think that's something important to note for the young person who may be, or the person, whether they're young or a young adult or older, who is looking for employment, but they are working with VR. So to answer that question, I think it's very much possible for that to happen. I think that the VR employee should definitely make certain that the young person is aware that this can happen as they go over what the process will be in, you know, helping them find employment. And if that young person decides, hey, I don't want my disability disclosed up front, then I think that, you know, the counselor through VR should definitely let that young person know whether or not they can proceed in helping them find work without disclosing. So in other words, if you can give that young person with a disability the options and make sure it's really clear, then I think you're operating in fairness and equity. But if you haven't done that and you disclose their disability and maybe they don't want that to happen, you know, then that could be problematic for the individual with a disability.
Great. Well, we do have a couple more questions, but we've already run over quite a lot. So we'll respond to those questions in the email that we send out to everyone. Thank you again, Jennifer, so much. This has been really, really valuable, and we've gotten a lot of thank yous and a lot of great feedback already. So thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Thank you for having me, Gabby.
No worries, and thank you all for joining, and I hope you all have a great rest of the week.